Imagine winding the clock back to the last day of 1998. You are a senior trader sitting in a high-rise office in Frankfurt or London. At this moment, fireworks are being prepped outside for New Year's Eve, and the streets are filled with that blind optimism unique to the millennium. But on the Bloomberg terminal in front of you, the weirdest scene in human financial history is playing out. 11 completely different currencies, representing 11 completely different credit ratings, economic strengths, and even national characters, are attempting to forcibly merge into a single candlestick chart. It feels like someone is forcing a rigorous, rigid German precision instrument factory, a loose and casual Italian cafe, and a French luxury shop, once glorious but now living off past laurels, to merge into the same holding company at the stroke of midnight. Moreover, this new group announces, starting tomorrow, no matter who you are or how bad your past credit was, we all share one credit card, infinite limit, shared PIN. This was the 1st of January, 1999, the birth of the euro. In the press releases that day, it was called a great milestone of European integration. Politicians stood on podiums with tears in their eyes, as if they had just eliminated the root cause of war on the European continent for the past millennium. But to those in the know, this wasn't a political marriage. It was a carefully packaged, unprecedented act of financial malpractice, because anyone who had done their due diligence could see that there were two groups of people with ulterior motives sitting at this massive negotiation table. One group was the rich, holding real cash and triple a credit, led by Germany. The other group was the poor relatives, pockets empty, debt-ridden, and desperate for a bailout, led by Italy and Spain, and later the latecomer Greece. According to normal commercial logic, the rich would never agree to sign a joint liability guarantee with the poor. When have you ever seen Apple willing to merge its balance sheet with a bankrupt P2P lending company? But the bizarre thing is that not only did the deal go through, but on that morning in 1999, it looked like a feast where everyone was happy. Why? Because fundamentally, this wasn't currency reform. It was a massive credit arbitrage scheme. We have to talk about the entry threshold first. This was possibly the largest scene of financial fraud in business history. Before this rich man's club called the Eurozone was established, to look somewhat legitimate, everyone solemnly agreed on the Maastricht criteria. This was like an IPO threshold for a public company, stipulating that for every country wanting to join, your fiscal deficit could not exceed 3% of GDP, and public debt could not exceed 60%. This red line was drawn very strictly. If strictly enforced, on the 1999 starting roster, probably only a pocket-sized nation like Luxembourg would have fully qualified. Even Germany itself would have struggled. And as for southern European countries like Italy and Spain, they were miles off the mark. If their debt statements were real, they shouldn't have been allowed into the Eurozone. They should have been sent directly to the ICU. It's like a group of poor kids trying to sneak into a high-end gala, but the security at the door is tight. What do? Enter Wall Street's shrewdest makeup artists. Top investment banks, led by Goldman Sachs, played a crucial role at this stage. They weren't there to solve the problems. They were there to hide the problems. It was a display of spectacular accounting magic. Take Italy, for example. At the time, the Italian government's debt was terrifyingly high and couldn't possibly meet the standard. If Italy was kicked out, the Eurozone would lose the largest market in southern Europe. If Italy was let in, that terrible balance sheet would look too ugly. So, a complex financial derivative called a currency swap was brought to the table. You don't need to understand the technical details. You just need to know the principle is very simple. It's moving future income to the present for bookkeeping, and moving current debt to the future to be paid later. It's like faking a bank statement to get a mortgage. The bank manager, in this case, the European Commission, actually knew exactly what was going on. But to meet lending targets, everyone tacitly chose to turn a blind eye. There were even more absurd operations. Some countries, to lower their deficit rates, actually bundled future tax revenues of state-owned enterprises and sold them to investment banks for cash to balance the books. Some countries invented a euro tax, forcibly collecting a sum from the people to suppress the deficit, planning to figure out a way to refund it after joining the alliance. Supported by these semi-compliant, waterlogged financial statements, on the 1st of January 1999, the gates opened. At that moment, a miracle happened. Or rather, the most charming bait of this Ponzi scheme appeared. To understand the shock of this moment, you must understand a key indicator: bond yields, the interest on borrowing money. Before 1999, if the Italian government wanted to borrow money, what would the market think? The market would think, these Italians change governments faster than they change clothes. They can't collect taxes, and they spend money recklessly. Lending to them is too risky. So the market demanded an extremely high-risk premium. Back then, the interest rate on the Italian lira was often over 10%. This meant that for every dollar Italy borrowed, it had to carry a heavy interest burden. This was the market's punishment for their reckless spending. And Germany. Germans are rigorous, rigid, and trustworthy. The mark was hard currency. When the German government borrowed money, the interest was only about 4%. This was the naked wealth gap and the most honest pricing of the market economy. But the second the euro launched on the 1st of January, 1999, this massive chasm was artificially filled. When Italy put on the euro vest, investors worldwide suddenly had a beautiful hallucination. They were no longer lending to that unreliable government in Rome, but to the European Central Bank. Subconsciously, they felt that although the Italians were taking the money, the filthy rich and extremely reliable big brother Germany was standing behind them as a guarantor. So overnight, borrowing costs for Italy, Spain, and Portugal fell off a cliff. From over 10%, they dropped directly to almost the same level as Germany. Imagine this scene. It is like you are a bankrupt gambler who owes money everywhere, usually having to beg loan sharks. Suddenly one day, because you acknowledge a billionaire as your godfather, the bank clears all your old debts, hands you a black card with an unlimited limit, and tells you, go ahead and swipe it. The interest is calculated at your godfather's rate. This is the true story that began in 1999. For Southern European countries, this was a windfall from heaven. Hundreds of billions in cheap capital rushed into their treasuries like a flood. Normally, if a country suddenly gets such cheap funds, what is the most rational thing to do? They should quickly swap out high-interest loans, reduce debt pressure, and then invest the money in education, technology, and manufacturing upgrades, striving to earn money by selling high-tech products like the Germans in the future, right? But in this story, we are talking about human nature. When money comes too easily, no one wants to do the hard work. At the start of that new millennium, the entire Southern Europe fell into a frenzy of consumerism. Since borrowing money was so cheap, why work hard on R&D? So, Greece began handing out the world's most enviable bonuses to civil servants. You would see absurd news like getting a monthly bonus just for knowing how to use a computer, getting a bonus just for showing up to work on time. Even after a civil servant passed away, their unmarried daughters could continue to collect their pension. Spain started building houses crazily on empty land. Capital rushed into real estate. Magnificent resorts rose along the Spanish coastline, and many airports didn't see a single plane land for years after being built. The entire country's economic engine switched instantly from manufacturing to construction and tourism. In the first few years of all this, everyone was happy. Even the Germans were laughing. This is the most hidden link in the entire scam. Why did the Germans watch their poor relatives spend recklessly without stopping them? Because although the black card in the poor relatives' hands was swiping future credit, what they were buying were Germany's current goods. The cheap euros squandered by Southern European countries eventually turned into orders for German factories. Greeks bought German submarines, Spaniards bought Siemens equipment, and Italians bought high-end German machine tools and BMWs. At this stage, Germany was essentially playing a high-level game of vendor financing. It's like I'm a car dealership owner. I lend you money to buy my car. My car is sold, inventory is cleared, the factory is running at full capacity, workers' jobs are stable, and GDP is soaring. As for whether you can pay back the money in the future, in this carnival honeymoon period, no one wanted to think about that buskill question. People only saw that in the first few years after the Eurozone was established, the economic data looked impossibly beautiful. Inflation was suppressed, trade boomed, and the standard of living in Southern Europe seemed to catch up with Northern Europe overnight. Politicians meeting in Brussels beamed with confidence. They believed they had created a new model that transcended economic laws. But they forgot one iron law of the business world that can never be violated. Mismatched credit must eventually return to the mean through a violent liquidation. You gave a poor man a rich man's credit limit. He didn't become a rich man because of it. He just became a poor man with more debt. And the rich man standing behind him as a guarantor, currently counting the cash from selling his goods, hadn't yet realized that he would soon be forced to pay the bill for this gamble. The countdown that locked everyone on the Titanic had actually quietly begun on that celebratory morning of the 1st of January, 1999. This crazy party lasted for a full 10 years, until a DJ on the other side of the ocean suddenly cut the power. In 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed. The U.S. subprime mortgage crisis swept across the globe like a tsunami. When the tide went out, everyone was horrified to discover that, on this European beach, not only were some people swimming naked, but even the credit towel used to cover their shame was borrowed. Let's push the lens to Greece in 2009. That winter, the newly elected Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou did something that should have been normal, but acted like a nuclear detonation at the time. Checking the books. The ledger left by the previous government was opened. Previously, Greece had claimed to the world that next year's fiscal deficit would be about 6% of GDP. But after Papandreou saw the books, he broke out in a cold sweat. The real number wasn't 6%, nor 8%, but a staggering 12.7%, later revised even higher. This wasn't overspending. This was total short selling. It's like you've been a VIP member of a top club respected because everyone thought your family was wealthy. Suddenly one day, you expose yourself. Actually, I don't have a dime in my pocket. All the cards I swiped before were cashed out using fake invoices, and I don't plan to pay them back. Instantly, the market went mad. Remember that interest rate spread that allowed Southern Europeans to enjoy 10 good years? It resurrected overnight and turned into a man-eating monster. International investors are greedy, but they aren't stupid. They immediately realized Greece's supplementary card has no authorization from the German main card. So, capital began to flee frantically. The interest on Greek government bonds rocketed from those comfortable lows like a missile, 10%, 20%, 30%. This meant Greece's path to borrowing new debt to pay off old debt was completely cut off. National bankruptcy was imminent. According to normal business logic, if a subsidiary is this rotten, the parent company usually has only one move: cut it loose, let it go bankrupt, liquidate assets, cut losses in time, and don't let the bad debt infect the parent company. That's what the German public thought at the time too. German streets were full of complaints. Why should we use our hard-earned tax money to feed those loafers who get off work at 3 p.m. to drink coffee? But here comes the most ironic and darkest part of the story. When German Chancellor Merkel and French President Sarkozy closed the door for an emergency meeting, they looked at another secret bill in their hands, and their faces were even grimmer than the Greeks, because they discovered a shocking secret. The creditors Greece owed money to weren't Greek grandmas, but German and French banks. Let's comb through this chain of interests again. 1. Over the past decade, German and French banks lent depositors money to the Greek government and companies. 2. Greeks used this money to buy German and French goods. 3. Now Greece couldn't pay it back. If Greece were allowed to go bankrupt at this moment, the unlucky ones wouldn't be the Greeks. The ones who would drop dead instantly were the suit-clad top bankers in Frankfurt and Paris. Germany's largest commercial banks had hundreds of billions of euros in risk exposure in southern European countries. If Greece defaulted, these accounts would instantly become bad debts. The German banking industry would immediately have a Lehman moment, and Europe's financial heart would stop beating on the spot. Do you see it? This wasn't a charity story of the rich helping the poor. This was a financial kidnapping case of transfusing blood to the debtor to save the creditor. At this juncture, commercial logic underwent the most twisted alienation. Because you owe me too much money, I absolutely cannot let you die. Thus, the most absurd special rescue team in history was established, the so-called Troika, composed of the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. They landed in Athens with hundreds of billions of euros in bailout funds. At the press conference, they told the cameras, "We are here to save the Greek people." But if you track the flow of funds, you see a chilling picture. This massive sum of life-saving money merely passed through the Greek accounts. The second the money hit the Greek Ministry of Finance's account, it was transferred out. Where to? Back to Deutsche Bank, back to BNP Paribas, back to the hands of international investment institutions holding Greek bonds. How is this a rescue? This was a perfect debt swap. Through this operation, the bad debt risk that originally belonged to private banks was successfully transferred to public institutions. In other words, what should have been bankers paying for their own investment mistakes turned into taxpayers across Europe paying for the bankers. But there is no free lunch. The bankers got out, but who paid the price? The price was paid by ordinary people in Greece with interest. Although the Troika gave money, it came with an austerity agreement tantamount to a deed of sale. It felt like a loan shark collection team taking over your company, shouting through a megaphone in the office. From today on, everyone takes a 20% pay cut. Sell all your most valuable ports, airports, and islands to pay off debts. Cut pensions, cut healthcare, cut education funding. This is the so-called austerity policy. On the streets of Athens, angry young people began throwing Molotov cocktails. The elderly lined up at banks to collect meager cash. Pharmacies ran out of imported drugs, and shops closed down one after another. By this time, the Eurozone had completely torn off the warm mask of a big family, revealing its hideous face as a cold-blooded holding company. For southern European countries, they lost control of their own nations. Their fiscal budgets had to be approved by Brussels first. Their assets were forcibly auctioned. They were no longer sovereign nations, but looked more like bankrupt companies taken over by creditors. For Germany, this was also a nightmare. Germans felt like the world's biggest suckers. They scrimped and saved, only to endlessly pour money into the bottomless pit of southern Europe. This created an unprecedented, mutual resentment on the European continent. Southern Europeans held signs depicting Merkel as a Nazi, saying Germany was conquering Europe again via financial means. Northern Europeans read newspapers calling Southern Europeans parasites, wishing they could kick them off the planet. This emotion reached its peak in the summer of 2015. At that time, someone even proposed a bold idea. Since this business is so painful, why not just break up? This leads to the most desperate ending of this commercial story. Why can't they get a divorce? In the normal business world, if a partnership fails, you liquidate and deregister. But in the blueprint of the Eurozone, the political elites, to show their determination of no return, intentionally made a fatal mistake. They designed an entrance, but they did not design an exit. Legally, there is no withdrawal mechanism. Technically, it is even more terrifying. The euros in the hands of Greeks and the euros in the hands of Germans are the same thing. If Greece exits and reprints its own currency, the drachma, the new currency, would immediately devalue by 50% or more. What does that mean? It means all of Greece's foreign debts in euros would instantly double. It means the savings in the hands of all common people would instantly become waste paper. That wouldn't just be bankruptcy. That would be societal collapse at a national level, potentially triggering civil war. And for Germany, if Greece exits, the dominoes fall. If Italy and Spain follow suit, Germany's export market, accumulated over decades, would be gone. The new Deutsche Mark would appreciate to a level that would suffocate the German export industry. So, in the end, this story turned into a complete zombie movie. Everyone is trapped on this leaking ship. The rich, led by Germany, have to curse while continuing to pay for duct tape to patch the ship. Because if the ship sinks, they die too. The poor, led by Southern Europe, have to endure hunger and humiliation while rowing desperately because jumping ship means drowning. To this day, this Ponzi scheme that started in 1999 has not ended. The crisis on the books seems to have passed, but that fundamental commercial bug, a unified currency with fragmented fiscal policies and completely different economic constitutions, remains like a ticking time bomb buried under the foundation of the European continent. Next time you travel to Europe and play with that exquisite euro coin in your hand, take a close look at it. It is stamped not only with patterns of different countries, but also with the greatest ambition in the history of human commerce, and the most expensive lesson. This is the story of the euro, a super monster company that was destined never to make a profit from day one, but is also destined never to be allowed to fail. Time jumps to the summer of 2012. The broken ship was about to sink. Greece could no longer be saved, and the fire had spread to Spain and Italy. The market was betting that the Eurozone would disintegrate within months. At this moment, Mario Draghi, president of the European Central Bank, stepped forward. In a speech in London, facing short sellers worldwide, he delivered the most famous line in financial history. "Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, and believe me, it will be enough." This line is classic because it thoroughly exposed the essence of fiat currency. In commercial logic, this sentence translates to, "I have a printing press. As long as you dare to sell off the bonds of Southern European countries, I will print money to buy however much you sell. My bullets are infinite. Your money is finite. If you want to die, try me." This was a naked short squeeze. The market was spooked, speculators retreated, and the euro was saved. Everyone sang Draghi's praises as the savior of the euro, but as calm observers, we must understand the cost behind this. Draghi's move essentially opened the Pandora's box of QE, quantitative easing. If the Eurozone is viewed as a company, this is equivalent to the CEO announcing, "Since we can't earn money and can't pay debts, we will frantically issue more stock, print money, and use waste paper to buy back bonds from the market." From then on, Europe entered a decade-long negative interest rate anomaly. This was an extremely abnormal period. In thousands of years of human commercial history, borrowing money required paying interest. But under Draghi's magic, a spectacle appeared in Europe. You deposit money in a bank. The bank charges you a management fee. You borrow money to buy a house. The interest is so low it is almost free. What is the logic of this operation? It's an attempt to stimulate the zombified economy by scattering money. They hoped Southern Europeans would take the money to consume, and companies would take the money to invest. But the result? As we said at the beginning, the DNA of this business is bad. The money did not flow into the real economy, nor into factories or R&D. Oceans of cheap euros flowed into the stock market and into real estate in Berlin, Amsterdam, and Paris. Asset prices for the rich skyrocketed, while wages for the poor didn't budge. This caused a deeper tear within the Eurozone. German retirees found their pensions shrinking in the bank due to negative rates, while the wealthy class with assets saw their wealth double. This false prosperity, maintained by a ventilator, finally hit an iceberg in 2020 and 2022. Phase 10, the moment of reckoning, inflation backlash. The pandemic hit and the Russia-Ukraine conflict erupted. Energy prices skyrocketed and supply chains broke. At this moment, the ghost that had been suppressed for 10 years, inflation, returned. For the Eurozone, this is the true checkmate. Why? Because this forced the Eurozone into a dead end where death waits on both sides. If they frantically raise interest rates to curb inflation, like the US did, the astronomical debt interest of Italy and Greece would explode instantly. Because they have barely survived on zero interest rates for the past decade, once interest rates return to normal levels, say 4% or 5%, their fiscal revenue wouldn't even cover the interest payments. That means debt crisis 2.0 erupts, and this time no one can save them. If they don't raise interest rates and keep printing money to get by, the Germans will go crazy. Germans have a historical fear of hyperinflation carved into their bones. Think of pushing a wheelbarrow of money to buy bread before WE. If the Eurozone lets inflation run wild to care for the poor relatives in Southern Europe, the domestic political pressure in Germany will flip the EU table over directly. You see, this returns to the initial knot from 1999. Do you need to cater to the German saver's logic or the Italian debtor's logic? In times of low inflation, you can muddle through by printing money. But in times of high inflation, you must choose one. The finale, a breakup with no winners. This is the situation we see today. The current Eurozone is like a resentful couple who can't even afford the legal fees for a divorce. Southern Europe still lacks competitiveness. Youth unemployment remains high, and it lives on transfer payments from Northern Europe, becoming Europe's nursing home. Germany, the former super engine, is rapidly becoming the sick man of Europe because it lost cheap Russian energy and is dragged down by Southern European debt. The euro, the currency that once tried to challenge the hegemony of the US dollar, is seeing its share of international payments shrink, looking more and more like a regional currency for self-amusement. If we were to write a final review summary for this 25-year-long business case, it would probably be this: attempting to use financial tools, a unified currency, to forcibly flatten huge differences in the real economy. National competitiveness is the most arrogant commercial experiment in human history. It proved that you can create a giant by merging balance sheets, but you can never, through merging balance sheets, Turn a man who only drinks coffee and sunbathes into a rigorous engineer. When the tide finally goes out, all that is left for Europe is a mess, and a generation of young people whose future has been overdrawn by debt. The story is over. If you were that trader sitting in Frankfurt in 1999, looking at today's candlestick chart, you would probably stub out the cigarette in your hand and say softly, "See, I told you this business wouldn't last."